Good day to everyone. I'm Kathleen Sullivan. I'm a lawyer and a partner at the law firm of Quinn, Emanuel, Urquhart, and Sullivan. I was previously a law professor at Harvard University and Stanford University, and it is my extraordinary privilege to welcome you to a wonderful session between two of the most brilliant and eloquent conversationalists you could possibly encounter. Let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll turn to the conversation. I'm pleased to introduce Chris Patten, or the Right Honorable Lord Patten of Barnes, who's an alumnus of Balliol College. His service to the nation is too long to encompass, but briefly, he was governor of Hong Kong, European Commissioner for External Affairs. He became Chancellor of the University of Oxford in 2003 and has presided over countless ceremonies at the university since then, and author of a memoir called First Confession, a sort of memoir. I'm pleased also to introduce my dear friend of 4 decades. We were contemporaries at Oxford, Michael Sandel, the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government at Harvard University, an alumnus of Balliol College, 1975. He burst onto the scene in 1982 with a book called Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, a work of political philosophy that marked him as a kind of successor to greats like John Rawls, his own mentor in many respects. He's taught a justice course at Harvard so popular it has to be taught in an amphitheater, usually reserved for rock concerts. And he speaks to global audiences like the one we have today through such enterprises as the BBC series, The Global Philosopher. He is now the author of, most recently, of the book called The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good, and that will be our topic for conversation today. I'd like to reiterate a warm welcome to all of the Oxford Old members who are with us today. Thank you very much for joining. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded, and I would encourage you to send questions and answers through the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll have a time at the end of the conversation between the Chancellor and Professor Sandel when we'll address your questions. And kindly, when you do send your question, if you could note your name and your college, it would be much appreciated. With no further ado, let me turn it over to the Chancellor of the University of Oxford, Lord Patten.
Thank you very much indeed, Kathleen. It's really kind of you to do this. And I must say, I'm really pleased to be able to have another chance with Michael, who's been somebody I've been able to meet very regularly over the years, and I'm a huge admirer and fan. That may limit the amount of dash and brio in the conversation. I'm not quite sure. Just before starting, can I just pay one short tribute to somebody I got to know when he was Chancellor of Cambridge University, Prince Philip, who, as we speak, is being lowered into his tomb in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, while the buglers play action stations. The Royal Navy sign that you're being attacked. But I once sent him a copy of a book I'd just written called What's Next? And he sent back his hand-typed reply straight away saying, what's next? He said, when you're my age, there's only one answer. Well, I'm afraid that's true for all of us. He's on the next stage of that journey today, but he was a remarkable man, not a meritocrat, but an example of what penniless refugees can achieve with a bit of good fortune and a following wind. Can I say straight away that I've enjoyed this book even more than I enjoyed What Money Can't Buy, and the last one, which I like particularly because so many economists that I don't like disliked it. So I really liked that book, and I very much enjoyed it, the challenge of the tyranny of merit. And I speak as somebody who has, as they say, got skin in this game, because I'm exactly what you would describe as a meritocrat. I'm a product of an important part of the post-war welfare system, the 1944 Education Act, which was designed to help girls and boys, mostly boys, I have to say, from lower middle class or working class backgrounds to get on the ladder through scholarships and so on into higher education and beyond. I went through an education like that. the first time I ever met a boy who'd been to boarding school was when I went to do the scholarship exams at Balliol, also the first time I'd ever met an Etonian or a Wykemis. So I'm, I suppose, an example of meritocracy, the replacement of the aristocracy of birth and class with, we always believed, the aristocracy of merit. One of the reasons why I was particularly excited when I was reading this book was to realize that something I'd always taken for granted, I'd only taken for granted because I hadn't gone back and read the original book. Michael Young, who wrote his book on meritocracy, is one of those books that's much referred to and rather less often read, I think. And what a lot of us have taken as a sort of an example of what decent politics on the left and on the moderate right should be aiming for is actually, when you read it, as Michael points out in his excellent book, it's a sort of dystopian satire. And he's horrified by the idea in the late 1990s that Tony Blair regarded meritocracy as the centerpiece of what moderate Labour politicians, center-left politicians should believe in. Because he was horrified by something that's, and I'll shut up after this, that Michael, that you wanted to point out to us all, that the other side of the notion that people who get to the top get there because they deserve it and therefore it justifies their position, is the notion that people who don't get to the top also deserve it. And unless you're very careful, they become what Hillary Clinton called inadvertently the deplorables. Michael Young said in an attack on Tony Blair that what Blair was doing and what people who talked about meritocracy as the centerpiece of their social and economic policy, what they were doing was leaving people who were in working jobs, blue-collar workers and so on, morally naked because they hadn't got on in life, they weren't making as much money because they didn't deserve to. And I think that assaulting that notion of meritocracy does us all a great service and allows us to talk about a number of issues, which I'm sure we'll do today, like social equity and what a decent society of the just, rather than an attempt at a society of equals, would amount to. Michael, over to you. Have I got it all wrong?
Well, you've got it all right, Chris, as always, except for one thing. I think that Chris Patten can no more suppress his dash and brio than the rest of us can suppress our capacity to breathe. Apart from that, I agree with everything you've said. For Michael Young, who coined the term, meritocracy was not an ideal of a just society. It was a dystopian possibility. And in my book, The Tyranny of Merit, I argue that he glimpsed something important. It's counterintuitive now because we think of merit as a good thing. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified doctor to perform it. So how can merit become a tyrant? Here's how. In recent decades, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do, I think, Chris, with the widening inequalities of recent decades. But it's not only that. I think it also has to do with the changing attitudes towards success that have come with the inequality. Those of us who've landed on top have come to believe that our success is our own doing, the measure of our merit. And just as you said, by implication, that those who fall short have no one to blame but themselves. They too must deserve their fate. Now, paradoxically, this way of thinking about success reflects the meritocratic ideal, the idea that if chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. So meritocracy has a dark side. There are two problems with it. One is that we don't live up to it, really. at places like Harvard and Stanford, there are more students from the top 1% than from the entire bottom half of the country. That's one problem. The deeper problem is that meritocracy has a dark side. It's corrosive of the common good. And the reason it's corrosive of the common good is that it generates hubris, I call it meritocratic hubris among the winners, and humiliation among those who lose out. And I think it's this feature of meritocracy that explains quite a lot of the backlash against elites that has fueled authoritarian populist figures like Donald Trump. And until we come to grips with it, I don't think it will be possible to heal the division, the rancor, and the polarization that hovers like a dark shadow over democracy these days.
It certainly has a real political consequence. It was very interesting. I thought to compare UK and US, what people who had higher education did when they were voting. That people in the US, on the whole, I think I'm right in saying, the great majority of those who'd had higher education voted against Trump. And the majority of people who voted for Trump hadn't had higher education. Here, 70% of the people who voted to remain in the European Union in the rather populist Brexit referendum, 70% of them had higher education. Overwhelmingly, the same sort of balance was there as in the United States in Trump's election. One of the things that amazed me in your book, I didn't know about it, was that the group in society in the UK who the educated were most critical of or looked down on most were those who hadn't been to university.
Yeah.
It wasn't a question of an ethnic group, it wasn't a question of race, it was whether or not you'd been to university. And it's a desperately worrying thing, a divide in society, because it raises all sorts of questions which are very difficult to address, except by looking again at things like vocational training and so on, which we've never been very good at in Britain. And maybe you're not as good as you should be in the United States, because I look at the figures for labor market expenditure by the central government, and they're, I think, a sixth of the average for OECD countries. So I think that's a sort of small but practical way in which we can start to address the issue. But there's a more fundamental thing which I'd like to ask for your view on. Every parent wants to do their best for their children. And that's true whether you're on the left or the right. So if you've got to the top, whether by your own merits or by luck or by a combination of the two, you'll want to do the best for your kids. So it becomes hereditary, this sort of privilege, and presumably the hubris becomes hereditary and the humiliation becomes hereditary. How do you address that normal parental wish, except of course you don't make it possible for people to pay money for others to take the exams for their kids? I mean, going back to that scandal in higher education which you start the book with. But how do you address that whether you're on the left or the right? It's a natural parental feeling.
Well, it is a striking feature of the way meritocracy works today and the credentialism that is so central to it, that well-off parents have figured out how to pass their privileges onto their children. In this respect, meritocracy is replicating precisely the feature of traditional aristocratic societies that meritocracy seemed to liberate us from, passing on privilege one generation to the next. With one important difference: the mechanism by which well-off parents pass their advantages onto their kids is not by bequeathing them vast estates and trust funds, though there's some of that. It's mainly by equipping them to compete successfully in the meritocratic tournament and to win admission to selective universities. And it's well documented that SAT scores, the college entrance examination scores in the US, very closely track family income, to say nothing of music lessons, cultural opportunities, hiring professional advisors to help craft the entrance essay, and so on. But it takes a toll. It takes this way of passing on privilege and advantage because it converts the adolescent years of young people to a stress-strewn, pressure-packed, meritocratic gauntlet hovered over by helicopter parents desperate to get their kids to compete successfully for admission. The result is alarming levels, even for the winners, especially for the winners, alarming levels of emotional and mental health challenges, levels of depression, anxiety born of the pressure to perform, and by the time students arrive, they bear injuries, wounds from this meritocratic gauntlet that make it difficult for them to step back, to reflect once they arrive in university on what's worth caring about and why, on what passions they really want to pursue with regard to teaching and learning. So habituated have they become to hoop jumping, credential mongering, and networking. And my fear, Chris, is that quite apart from the damaging effect on those who are excluded by this system, who can't hope to compete, that making universities into sorting machines for a market-driven meritocratic society is bad for us because it is threatening to crowd out the networking and credentializing and sorting function is leaving less and less space for the educational mission, for cultivating and pursuing the love of teaching and learning and scientific research for their own sake. So like all tyrannies, the tyranny of merit exerts its oppressive force in two directions: toward those who lose out and are deprived of social recognition and esteem, and to the wounded winners. So if we look at the relation of parents, it's interesting, some economists did a study showing that the tendency of helicopter parenting hovering over every aspect of one's child, especially in the adolescent years, markedly increased during the age of widening inequality and neoliberal globalization. So even the relation between parents and children and the operation of universities as institutions for learning are corrupted and tyrannized by the meritocratic way of transferring privilege and advantage. What do you think of that? Do you think that overstates it, or do you see glimmers of that as well?
Don't, and I think there's a problem you have in the United States, which I guess you could correct fairly easily, which is bigger than anything we have in the UK, I think, and that is legacy preference. There was a very written by some Wall Street Journal writers a few years ago, which I remember reading, and it's about access to universities, and the writers sit in on a coaching class being given to a bunch of well-off kids in Manhattan, and they're being prepared for interviews to Duke and elsewhere. And one of the coaches says to these young men, "Now look, the first question they're going to ask you is, what will you bring to Duke if we give you a place?" And the first boy says, "A library."
There you go. There you go.
when my youngest daughter, this was back when I was in Hong Kong, but well before I was Chancellor of the university, when my youngest daughter was looking at whether to go, which university to go to, she wasn't remotely interested in Oxford because she thought that I might influence Oxford into taking her. I said, I have no idea. It's exactly the reverse. If they knew who I was, it'd make it certain that you didn't get in. So I don't think we have that problem, but we do have problems about access, which we're addressing quite imaginatively. And that's not because of us. I think it's because of the quality of education, certainly in some parts of the country. I wanted to move on a little bit and ask you what Daniel Bell wrote about, I think his expression was well-tempered meritocracy. What is well-tempered meritocracy? What do you have to, if you're a meritocrat, if you've got through this system to the top and you think, even if you're modest about it and you don't think it's entirely because of your own genius, what should you be doing to make the system fairer and to make, you can't produce an equal society. What do you do to produce, as he would say, a more just society?
I think to begin, before we get to policy proposals, Chris, I think to begin, we need a kind of moral and even spiritual turning in the way we think about success, including one's own success. The more we believe that our success is our own doing, the less alive we are to the luck and good fortune that helped us on our way, and the less indebted we are to those who made our success possible. Parents, families, teachers, communities, country, the times in which we live. The more alive we are to the contingencies and accidents and sources of debt that enable us to succeed, the greater our ability to imagine ourselves in other people's shoes, and the less the tendency to inhale so deeply of our success that we presume that those who struggle must deserve their fate too. And so one of the virtues that is in very short supply in a meritocratic age is humility, the humility that comes with an appreciation of the contingency of one's lot. And from humility can come a greater sense of mutual responsibility for everyone in the society, regardless of how well credentialed. Now, getting to it, so that's, I think, cultivating humility as a civic virtue in this way, I think is one important step morally. Politically, I think we need to shift the terms of public discourse from asking, how can we arm people for meritocratic combat, and instead focus on renewing the dignity of work, renewing the social esteem that should be accorded everyone who contributes to the common good, regardless of how well credentialed. And more broadly, I think we should recognize that even if we could perfect equality of opportunity, even if we could remove all barriers to fair competition, we would still not have a just society or a good society, because what would be missing would be what Tawney, the great English Christian socialist of the 1930s, described as a broad democratic equality of condition. Now, what I mean by equality of condition is not that everyone must have the same income and wealth, but there does need to be broad democratic access to sources of learning, to the culture, and to a way of being that enables everyone, whatever their walk in life, to stand with their head up, to look their fellow citizens in the eye as democratic equals, to deliberate about the common good, to feel a stake in the common life. And this is what we've lost. We've lost partly because the age of meritocracy has coincided with a market-driven age that has widened inequalities and led those who were affluent and those who come from more modest backgrounds essentially to live separate lives. We live and work and shop and play in different places. We send our kids to different schools, and there are fewer and fewer class mixing institutions, public places and common spaces that bring us together in the ordinary course of life. Not perfect equality, but enough common places where people from different backgrounds encounter one another and bump up against one another in the course of their everyday lives, because this is how we learn to negotiate and to abide our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. So that's the alternative picture, the alternative ethic, the alternative frame for public discourse that I argue for in the book, Chris.
I was looking up while you were talking, a wonderful little book by somebody called Peter Hennessy, who's one of our best political historians, really. He's written very well about a variety of things, including how we deal with our nuclear deterrent. But he wrote a very good little book called Establishment and Meritocracy, and he finished it. He went to the same Catholic school in West London. He's a bit younger these days. He finished it by quoting the former Bishop of London, who wrote about this or gave a sermon about all this, and quoted Paul's letters to the Corinthians: "True knowledge puffs up, love builds up," which is a rather good way of making, I think, the point that you're making. If you're on the left in politics, you'll think that somebody who's done well at university should be appropriately treated. That it's awful that, I don't know, that professors don't get paid as much as hedge fund managers. So there are different ways in which left and right address the issue, I think, of meritocracy. But can I ask you how in the United States the question of race touches on all this? I don't know why I'd never read Tocqueville on America before. I'd read, for my degree, I read Tocqueville on the Ancien Régime. And last summer, doing a sort of jag with Cicero and then Tocqueville and Burke, I was fascinated by how in the 1830s and 1840s, Tocqueville picked on or identified race as being a real problem in American society even there. And I wonder whether that's presumably an issue which is made more difficult to deal with because of the sort of social inequity, the sort of social divisiveness that you've been talking about.
Yes. In fact, I would say that one of the few hopeful signs during this period of pandemic and inequality and political polarization, one of the few hopeful signs came last summer with the outpouring of support for the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the killing by police of George Floyd. And the Black Lives Matter movement by last summer had become a multiracial, multi-generational movement for social justice, including racial reckoning. This is a hopeful sign. And what's striking about it as a political movement and a political project is how far removed it is from the meritocratic frame of political purpose and project. The real challenge to racial justice in the United States involves such elemental facts as police repeatedly killing unarmed Black men at traffic stops, or the massive incarceration rate, which falls especially heavily on Brown and Black communities. And dealing with these injustices can't be reached by simply trying to perfect the meritocracy. It requires facing directly inequalities of power as well as wealth that have been deeply exacerbated by the American struggle with questions of race. We can see in this pandemic another example. Those of us, now in many ways, the pandemic simply exaggerated and highlighted inequalities that existed before the pandemic, but it did so in a potentially revealing way. Those of us who had the luxury of being able to carry on work from home and holding meetings on Zoom couldn't help but recognize how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook. Not only those caring for COVID patients, I'm thinking also of delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, home health care providers, childcare workers, truckers. Now, these are not the best paid or most honored workers in our society, and yet now we are calling them essential workers or key workers. So this could be the opening of how we might reconfigure the economy to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of the work they do. And many of these essential workers, who, by the way, do not, for the most part, have lustrous university credentials. Many of the essential workers are people from communities, from Black and brown communities, who have suffered greatly, disproportionately during the pandemic, because they have been out incurring risk to perform services that enable the rest of us to stay at home. So these are two potential points of departure away from the rhetoric of meritocracy and rising and toward a more generous kind of politics that reckons directly with inequalities of income, wealth, and race, rather than offers the workaround of leaving those inequalities in place, but asking how can we enable individual upward mobility if you get the proper credentials.
I very much agree with that. It was interesting in the early stages of COVID here, of the pandemic here, the mortality figures among bus drivers, for rather obvious reasons, and it's been the same right the way through, that people in what you were just saying we now call essential services were the ones who were being clobbered. It doesn't seem to be very persuasive when it gets people to accept the individuals directly concerned that they need higher pay. But governments are going to have to face up to that sooner or later. Otherwise, there'll be a populist explosion about it, I think. Can I just say one thing about the prescription and trying to create a society which is more just, which recognizes the dignity of labor, and you say quite a bit this in the book. This morning, I was reading a piece by a friend of mine who writes an extremely good column in our papers about, he was talking about dealing with China. And he said that we have to recreate the notion of the free world. And when I tried, I rather agreed with that. And then I tried to write down what I thought the free world meant, because I'm older than you, but I grew up in the 50s and 60s when people threw the phrase about, and you didn't need to define it. And I myself really writing a piece, or about to write a piece, which in effect said, bring back yesterday. And I just wonder to what extent some of the prescriptions that you have, I mean, you have a wonderful description of how much better we were governed America was governed in the 1940s and 50s by, first of all, with the international impact, particularly Roosevelt and Truman, and then Eisenhower in the 50s, who did remarkable things for US infrastructure and housing, which nobody's done since. And I just wondered, is there a danger when you look at things like issues like the dignity of labor and like the balance between Uber drivers and Uber management? Is there a danger of appearing to want a better yesterday, or to bring back yesterday, rather than to find ways in which you can define those things in the context of what's happened because of globalization and urbanization and changes in information technology?
I think there is always that danger. And one of the examples you just gave, the gig economy, Uber drivers, what would it mean to renew the dignity of work in a gig economy? I think that's an enormously important question. And central to that question is whether gig workers, Uber drivers, should be classified as employees or as so-called independent contractors. And we're only just coming to grips with this, to say nothing of the role of unions, whether it's possible to revive and strengthen unions as a way of giving voice to workers and dealing with globalization. But I think it's important. So I think it is important not to allow nostalgia to creep in, but I think it is also important to notice that elites, the meritocratic elites who have governed since the 1980s, have not done very well at governing. Never mind the hubris. They've not done very well at their job. You mentioned the successful, the relatively successful record of the elites who governed, say, from 1940 to 1980. They won World War II, they helped rebuild Europe and Japan, they strengthened the welfare state, they dismantled segregation in the United States, and they presided over 4 decades of economic growth that flowed to rich and poor alike. That's a pretty good record. But if you look at the meritocratic elites, and for the most part, technocratic elites, who have governed from 1980 to the present, what have they achieved? They brought us 4 decades of stagnant wages for most workers, inequalities of income and wealth not seen since the 1920s, the Iraq War, a 20-year war in Afghanistan, financial deregulation, the financial crisis of 2008, decaying infrastructure, the highest incarceration in the world in the case of the US, and a system of campaign finance that makes a mockery of democracy. That, even from the standpoint of governance, never mind fairness, never mind justice, this is not a great record. And I think the key to the failure is that traditional notions of meritocracy connect merit in governing with moral and civic and practical political judgment, the ability to deliberate about the common good and to identify with people from all walks of life. Merit in governing, properly understood, is not only technocratic, it's not only about efficiency, it's not only about being a good economist, a value-neutral economist, supposedly. It's about these moral and civic capacities for judgment. Aristotle called it phronesis, practical judgment. And I think the failures, the litany of failures of governing elites in recent decades have a lot to do with this detachment of the notion of merit in governing from moral and civic judgment and capacity. And so any attempt to affirm the idea that the best should govern has to reconceive what we mean by best. And you'll appreciate this, Chris, that requires putting economists in their proper place.
Gentlemen, this is Kathleen Sullivan, Chancellor, and Professor Sandel. You have sparked enormous interest and dialogue with the audience, and we have so many questions that I hope I can try to organize them into a bit of a discussion. And I want to start with the observation that, of course, Michael's book is contesting the idea of meritocracy, but meritocracy was conceived by those who thought it was utopian and not dystopian, as a way of breaking up old hereditary hierarchies, or what some might call old boys clubs. I was at Wadham, one of the first 5 of the men's colleges to admit women. And when women were allowed to attend those early pioneers, it's now much more universal to have coeducation at Oxford. Wadham's standing went way up in the Norrington table. Academic achievement of the college was increased by opening to people who hadn't been there before. So there are a number of questions that ask the question, why isn't the solution to the failed experiment of meritocracy, Professor Sandel, to simply improve the way in which we have meritocracy at universities? And let me give you a sampling of questions from our participants that raised this question. And I'll direct these, Professor Sandel, initially to you. Fred Riss of my college, Wadham, notes that in this series earlier in the week, the Vice Chancellor said she wanted Oxford to be known as a meritocracy, by which he'll assume she intended to contrast to old boys clubs. And shouldn't Oxford wish to be known that way, or how else? Let me add some more questions along these lines. Artemis Gauss of St. John's asks, what in your view would be the fairest system of making accessible to all rewards of the magnitude of an Oxbridge education? Is a truly fair model feasible in your view? And I would just note parenthetically that at my college, Wadham, Warden Ken McDonald has led a wonderful initiative to increase access, not just in the admissions process, but in preparing students from state schools to apply to Oxford in the first place through pre-college programs. Relatedly, Stephen Ruth of Mansfield asks, the undergraduate admission rates in the Ivy League schools are between 3 and 6%. How, if we're to improve meritocracy, do you change the way that these schools determine who gets in? And Eileen Kong, along the same lines, and then I'll stop and let you respond, Professor Sandel, says, if meritocracy of talent doesn't fix inequality from aristocracy of birth or plutocracy of wealth, then what are possible practices to give the disadvantaged inclusive education opportunities to break class stratification? So focusing on university admissions as our first topic, would you like to respond to that set of questions about perfecting meritocracy and having more young students like the Chancellor from St. Benedict's at Ealing, rather than gutting the entire thing top to bottom?
Right. Well, let me say first, Kathleen, what a joy it is to be in conversation with you in this question session. We go back a long way, back to your days in Wadham College and mine in Balliol, and colleagues subsequently. And I would say, remembering your years in Wadham, Kathleen, that any college that Kathleen Sullivan attends, by definition, overflows with merit in the best sense. As for what should be the role of universities, I would say this. First, responding to those who say, isn't it a good thing to break down barriers and to increase access to long excluded members of society? And the answer to those questions is emphatically yes. Encouraging people to go to university is a good thing. Broadening access, especially to those who've been excluded or can't afford it, is even better. So that's not in question. The question is, what should be the role of universities in our society? We have made universities the arbiters we've made universities the arbiters of opportunity in a meritocratic society. It is they who confer the credentials and define the merits that a market-driven meritocratic society rewards. And my argument is that that role is at best a mixed blessing. It's not good for democracy. And I think it's not even good for higher education itself. We've discussed, and in the conversation with Chris, why I think this isn't good for democracy. We need to remember, those of us who spend our days in the company of the credentialed can easily forget that most people don't have a university degree. In America, nearly 2/3 of Americans do not have a 4-year degree. And this figure is similar in Britain and most of Europe. So it's folly to create an economy that sets as a necessary condition of dignified work and a decent life a university degree that most people don't have. To the contrary, it's not only unjust, it's a recipe for the kind of anger and resentment that figures like Trump successfully exploit. Now, to come, Kathleen, more directly to the question, what should universities do? And it's true that some of the universities have acceptance rates now below 5%. 57,000 young people applied to Harvard this year for about 2,000 places. The figures are similar in Stanford. So I have in the book, and this may cause the chat questions to flame up with challenges. I have a proposal, a provocative proposal in the book, which is, and Chris knows what I'm referring to. I call it the lottery of the qualified. Of those 50,000 applicants, I would have the admissions committee cull out those who are not well qualified to do the work and do it well and to contribute to the education of their fellow students. Then with the rest, how many? Maybe 20 or 25 or 30,000. With the rest, those who are well qualified to flourish at Harvard or Oxford or Stanford or Duke, I would admit by lottery, a lottery of the qualified. I have a hunch. I could be wrong. We could test it with an experiment, but I have a hunch that the level of discussion in my classes would not be any less good than it is now. Maybe it would be better. And more importantly, it would send a message to the students who got in. It would teach what is in any case already true, that there's a lot of luck involved in who winds up being admitted. And it would also send the same message to those who don't win admission, that this is not a verdict on your desert or your worth. This has a lot to do, this is shot through with contingency. So there it is, Kathleen, my proposal for a lottery of the qualified. Are you scandalized by it?
I think as a former administrator and dean of a law school, it might make fundraising more of a challenge. And so I think we have to think about intergenerational effects on universities of loyalty to universities. It's wonderfully exemplified here by the attendance of our alumni at this event. But I wonder if the Chancellor, you have a response to Michael's proposal? Do you think that Professor Sandel would, in some ways, if we make university attendance a matter of luck, undermine the ties of loyalty to universities we see exemplified today?
Well, I don't mean to be critical, but Michael slightly, it may be different in the United States, but Michael slightly slipped around what is, I think, our biggest problem in increasing access or broadening access at Oxford or other universities, and that is whether or not those who apply to come to the university have the qualification or have the ability to enjoy and do well with our system of education. Now, it's not just whether or not they get the right scores in their 18 plus or 17 plus examinations. It's also about other things. It's extraordinary how many people we have these very good summer schools, extremely successful, when we're trying to mentor kids from difficult backgrounds and to give them the sort of the confidence to go for Oxford and to get in. But it's very often the case that there are all sorts of things which they're not accustomed to. Sometimes sitting down and eating a meal with other people, simple things. They come from homes very often with no books. It's not just a question of whether there's IT equipment, where they haven't been used to much conversation in the evenings or with parents and so on. So there are all sorts of issues which aren't just a question of scores in exams, but we are trying very hard. Louise has done more than I think any other recent university head, certainly at Oxford. The Cambridge have been doing quite well as well, to be honest, to broaden our access without in any way risking standards. Because if you broaden access and you give people places at the university and then they're finding it difficult and they drop out, you're not doing them any favors, and you're not doing yourself any favors. So you've got to strike a balance. But what lets us down above all isn't the efforts of universities in Britain, it's what's happening in secondary schools, and particularly in some parts of the country. I used to be Chancellor of another university, which one of my daughters went to, Newcastle, which is a very good research university. But the proportion of kids going into higher education in the northeast of England is abysmally small. So inevitably, when you look at figures for a university like Oxford or Cambridge, you find far more kids from the southeast than from the northeast of England. And that is because, I'm afraid, of the quality of education and because of a sort of cycle of deprivation, or not necessarily deprivation, but low expectations, which we've got to do something about. We have to spend more on schools. We have to spend more on teachers in schools. We have to do more at a university like Oxford to encourage Teach First, which I think is similar to a scheme you have for encouraging young people to spend a couple of years after they've graduated, if they don't know exactly what they want to do, to go and teach in schools in difficult, disadvantaged areas. I think Oxford has the highest number of kids from any university doing that, but we should do even better. Why can't you get trained maths teachers in so many of our secondary education schools? It's a real problem. So that if you look at the number of kids of color, well, black kids in particular, who've got the highest marks in maths, it's abysmally small, and it's not their problem, not their fault. It's because we haven't put enough resources into teaching them.
Kathleen, could I give a quick response to what you and Chris have said? First, I agree, of course, completely with what Chris has said about strengthening and making more equal secondary schools. No question about that. As for the applicants from poor backgrounds, and especially I would say from backgrounds from families who have not gone to college previously, in previous generation. One way of amending my proposal for the lottery of the qualified would be, say one has 2,000 places, start out by accepting 400 or 500 well-qualified students who are first generation college students, and then run the lottery. And Kathleen, if you're worried about donors, you could give children of donors 2 lottery tickets or 3 lottery tickets or 5 if you really want, but at least that would be honest about the advantage that we're assigning to potential donors. But the broader point is this: we make a mistake if we assume and expect that higher education is an engine of upward mobility that could begin to solve the general social problem of inequality. It doesn't. In fact, here's one indication of why. Raj Chetty, an economist and a team, studied mobility rates at 800, across 800 American colleges and universities, public and private, selective and non-selective, and asked what proportion of students in these places arrive from poor families and rise as adults to affluence, top 20%. The proportion, the mobility rate across this huge swath of American higher education, 2%. 2%. Now that's not because exposure to a university education doesn't give one a big advantage in the job market and in income. It's because there are so few students from poor backgrounds in these places to begin with. Higher education is like an elevator in a building that most people enter on the top floor.
Well, let's turn to this, another set of questions that address the broader problem of inequality and ask whether universities can change anything against that backdrop. And again, I apologize, we can't cover all the questions, brilliant questions people have sent in, but let me group questions from people who ask, what are some other broader political solutions that one, or economic solutions one might embrace to address the issues you raised, Professor Sandel. Ryan Harrison of Wolfson says, what about basic income, baby bonds, 100% death tax as a way to blunt the intergenerational accumulation of wealth, reduce the linkage between merit and status? Holger Blenska of St. Edmund Hall says, what about the Vienna model of bringing different social spheres together to mix living and housing in quarters, a matter of urban or societal housing policy? And rather than having meritocratic separations even for living quarters. And along similar lines, Tessa, sorry, we've got so many good questions. Let me just find this other one that relates. Tessa van der Willigen of Lady Margaret Hall says legacy preference at US universities, the one we were just talking about, are an easy target, but what about more broadly? What are the limits to how much parents should be allowed to give their children a leg up? And are such limits like 100% estate tax, are they going to be politically feasible? So those broader issues, housing policy, wealth transfer policy, income policy at birth. Professor Sandel, thoughts about those as a complement to what you propose for higher education?
Many of those policies are ones that I think we should seriously consider. But broadly speaking, I think we need to shift the terms of public discourse from asking, how can we enable a relative handful of people to escape vast inequality through individual upward mobility through higher education? That rhetoric of rising, I think, has misled us. It's been a workaround to dealing with inequality rather than confronting inequalities of income and power and wealth directly. And that requires reconfiguring the economy. And it also requires shifting the underlying ethic, which is why I focus so much on attitudes towards success. I think the political project that should replace or at least supplement the rhetoric of rising is one focused on the dignity of work. And some of the tax proposals that people have mentioned, Kathleen, and that you just read out, could be framed in this way. One example that I especially like is to consider a financial transactions tax and to use the proceeds of that tax to lower taxes on labor and on work. The tax system sends a message about what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. When we, through the payroll tax, for example, tax those who work for a living at a higher rate, and the income tax at a higher rate than those who make their money from capital gains and dividends, that runs afoul of an appreciation of the dignity of work. On the other hand, the explosion of finance as a share of the US and UK economies in recent decades has led to enormous rewards for those in the financial industry. The explosion of finance wouldn't be such a problem if it actually led to more factories being built, more businesses, more homes, roads, airports, hospitals. But so much of finance does not contribute to economic productivity or to the common good in this way, that we should question the assumption that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. And a political project focused on the dignity of work would question and challenge that assumption and take back from markets the judgment about what really counts as a contribution to the common good. Make that the subject of political debate. And then we can argue about what tax schemes can best enable us to have those arguments about what contributions matter most, Kathleen.
Well, this is a wonderful point to come close to the end. I'm going to give the Chancellor last word, but I just want to say that Michael's remarks just at the moment echo very thoughtful questions posed by Marie Harrison of Kellogg, who says, how much does snobbery surrounding manual trades lie at the root of tyranny of merit? And John Scott of Balliol says, isn't celebrity culture something that biases us toward the celebration of wealth? So there are cultural factors as well that surround this, and what you talked about as a kind of spiritual reframing is part of your enterprise. We have come to the end. I apologize to all those whose questions we didn't reach, and I would like to turn to the Chancellor for our closing words before we end our session.
I'd just like to thank you, Kathleen. I'd like to thank Michael for your contributions. We could obviously go on for another a couple of hours, but don't suggest that, because here it's getting close to first dry martini of the daytime. So I'll want to move on to that. But can I just say just two things? First of all, there is obviously an agenda about resources, about public spending and tax. And I'm not a hugely rich man. I'm very well off. Somebody like me should pay more tax for two reasons. First of all, because of my age, and older people in the United Kingdom are terribly undertaxed, whereas the younger people are overtaxed. Secondly, I should certainly pay more tax because of the resources I have. But secondly, I don't think that it's wrong for me to be able to help my children and grandchildren. I think once you get into, as it were, that sort of almost eugenics in stopping parents doing their best for their children and grandchildren, then you're getting into a sort of society, sort of Spartan society, which I wouldn't want to live in. So I think we have to do a better job in providing, in broadening access. And on the last point that you raised about snobbery in relation to some jobs, one thing we should certainly be doing in the UK, and I guess you should perhaps in the United States as well, we should be devoting far more resources to vocational training, which has been horribly squeezed over the years in comparison with education lower down and higher up. So I'm all for us producing more of our own roofers and plumbers and electricians, and celebrating their work rather than being obliged to encourage people from the Ukraine, like on my roof out there, to come and live here and work here, because we can't do the jobs ourselves.
Well, it has come time for us to close, and perhaps a note of optimism is the fact that the pandemic may have brought us to have greater respect for all the essential work people do in many contexts. And I want to close just by thanking the Chancellor and Professor Sandel for an absolutely magnificent discussion, to thank all of the audience members who submitted the questions that we did get to and those we didn't, to thank you all and to wish you a wonderful sort of reflection on today's marvelous conversation. Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you, Professor Sandel. Goodbye to all the assembled Oxford members here.
Buy the book, buy the book. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. You were wonderful as always.